Welcome back to News Talk. Civil rights leaders marked the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act this week with a mixture of feelings. On the one hand, the 1965 law was a landmark achievement of the civil rights era. At the same time, however, the right to vote is under attack as a new wave of voter suppression takes root around the country. Samantha Lachman is a reporter for the Huffington Post and joins us now. Great to have you with us. Thanks very much
thank
for
you
coming
for
in.
having me.
Let's talk first about the 50th anniversary of the 1965 signing by President Lyndon Johnson of the Voting Rights Act. This was a monumental achievement. This was a heavy lift. It was not a guarantee that this would ever come about. Civil rights activists and advocates continue to cheer that legislative achievement.
Sure. I mean, the Voting Rights Act, which marked its 50th anniversary last Thursday, August 6th, has been called the most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever passed by the United States, the crowning jewel of the civil rights movement. But the problem is now you're seeing, after the Supreme Court gutted key provisions of the law in 2013, you're seeing sort of a wave of new laws that have been able to take root because of how the Supreme Court specifically weakened the legislation.
The 1965 Voting Rights Act was very specific in terms of identifying places where there were big hurdles and obstacles to people registering and participating in our democracy. And the court compared sort of where we are today, or where we were in 2013, against that moment in time when the legislation was being crafted, and they said, you know what, it was valid at the time, but it needs updating now. Right,
exactly. So Chief Justice John Roberts said that the South has changed, quote unquote. But you're seeing now, like, what happened under the Voting Rights Act is that you had states like Texas who had to clear any changes with their election laws with the federal government or in federal court. So Texas has this voter ID, voter identification law, that they couldn't pass in 2011 when the legislature passed it and sent it to former Governor Rick Perry's desk. But they were able to pass it right after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. And now you just saw last week, the day before the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, that a federal appeals court said that the voter ID law violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, that it had discriminatory effects because 600,000 Texans didn't have the appropriate kind of ID that they needed. So even though some of the justices in the majority seem to think that the Voting Rights Act, this provision was no longer needed, I mean, the day before the 50th anniversary, clearly we saw that it does still serve a purpose.
You mentioned Texas. Virginia, too,
yeah,
was on that list of places that needed to have any changes in their voting system approved by, I guess, the Justice Department before they can take effect.
Yeah, exactly. There was a bunch of different states that were covered, the entire state, like Texas, and then there were other places like most of North Carolina's counties were covered, and then there'd be random counties in other states. So it was a pretty sweeping law, and that provision in particular is the one that civil rights activists say is the one that needs to be restored by Congress, but there really isn't any bipartisan, I mean, there isn't bipartisan support in Congress to restore the Voting Rights Act.
And so without the identification, without the labeling, the targeting, whatever the appropriate word is, without an update on that Section 5 piece, there is no Voting Rights Act today.
Well, there still is, but it's just that the provisions that are left over have much less bite. There's Section 2, which says that you can't have provisions that discriminate on the basis of race or membership in a minority language group. But that provision just hasn't been as successful in preventing the kind of legislation that stops people from voting.
When voting rights advocates talk about voter suppression, what are they referring to? What types of things are problematic in their eyes?
Sure. Well, the voter suppression that civil rights activists talk about looks different now than what it looked like at the time. Like, if you read accounts, I talked to people who were prevented from voting because they had to pay a poll tax in Mississippi, people who had to memorize the Constitution because they'd be asked to cite like a random part of the Constitution in order to be able to cast a ballot, or people who just straight up tried to register over and over again, would pass those tests and still weren't able to vote. So that's what it looked like in the 50s and 60s. Now you have voter identification laws in Texas where, like, a gun ID is valid but a student ID from a state university isn't, or you have huge cuts to early voting. African Americans in North Carolina were found much more likely to use early voting than other types of voters. So you see cuts to early voting, cuts to weekend voting. You know, maybe people don't have the time to take off from work. They're working, you know, midnight shifts, and so they just can't get to the polls in time. So the types of restrictions are more subtle, but they still have an effect, people say.
People who are pushing for a broad and inclusive voting system in this country believe pretty deeply that this is partisan. Fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And there's people who would say that we need to just call it what it is, which is that African-American voters, Latino voters are more likely to vote for Democrats. And so if you put
younger voters, too,
younger voters,
to use the student ID.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you don't allow student IDs, that's also an attack on students. So there are people who say that this is not necessarily about race, although the two are kind of inextricably linked, that this is much more about partisanship. And so the problem is that you don't really have, it's not illegal to pass a law that helps the people who vote for you. It doesn't help the people who don't vote for you. And so that's sort of the issue that civil rights activists are running into.
The people who are advancing and advocating for these new requirements maintain quite strongly that they are about protecting the integrity of the system, making sure that no one claiming to be you goes to the poll before you're able to get there and votes in your name. Isn't that... Can you speak to that claim that this is not about helping one side or hurting another,
right,
or both, that it's about the integrity of the system, which surely is a universally held belief,
absolutely,
desire.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the issue is that while some types of fraud, like ballot box stuffing, may have happened in the past, the instances of in-person impersonation fraud, which is what like a government-issued photo ID requirement would prevent, are like remarkably low. In North Carolina, there's a trial that just concluded over a bunch of restrictions that North Carolina passed, and I think the witnesses for the state cited 2 instances of fraud that they either suspected or had actually convicted in the state's history. So there's just a remarkably few number of instances of the type of fraud that these restrictions are ostensibly preventing.
An expert in voting from Loyola University Law School, I believe there was a story in the Washington Post not that long ago where he said that there were 31 suspected instances of fraud in, might have been the 2012 cycle, don't hold me to that, 31 instances out of 1 billion votes cast.
Right.
So while one is too many, when you look at how much effort is being made in this voter ID, voter suppression, depending on how you view it, you look at how much effort is being made and what the problem is, it's hard for some to reconcile. Right,
exactly. I mean, it's a question of values. If that's what you really believe, then you can make a case for that, but then people are going to inevitably say, yeah, but like, look how few cases there are. Is it really worth it to disenfranchise thousands of people in the name of tracking down the remarkably few instances of voter fraud that you're even able to point to or cite?
What are people doing to push back against this wave of voter suppression, if that's what we want to call it?
Sure. Well, there's legislation that's been proposed in Congress, but we, the Huffington Post, we compared, how much support there was for the Voting Rights Act when it was initially passed and when it was reauthorized in 2006, and there were Republicans who were totally on board with it. And now I think there's legislation in the House to restore the Voting Rights Act, and there's only like 12 Republican co-sponsors. So if nothing happens at the congressional level, then really the efforts need to be at the state level. And so you're seeing Oregon passed a first in the nation law to have automatic voter registration with information from the DMV. States are trying to add more early voting. In New Jersey, they're trying to do that. And so really the efforts have to be at the state level to make access more broad in the absence of any action at the federal level.
And some people are trying to get a conversation going about the system we have where you vote on a Tuesday and you have to go to a place.
Yeah.
In this time of technology, in this time of busy schedules, the question is, why don't we vote over a weekend? Why can't we vote on our device?
Right.
You have to, any change has got to be with integrity, voter integrity in mind, but these old-fashioned notions shouldn't just live in perpetuity if a better system can be found, and I think that's the conversation at least some are trying to get going.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different proposals on the table. The presidential candidate Bernie Sanders has said that we should make Election Day a national holiday. Right. States like Colorado and Oregon have universal mail-in voting, so every registered voter is mailed their ballot and everyone can return their ballot through the mail, so that's like a really easy form, and those states I think have like 70% turnout, much higher than the rest of the country. So there are a lot of different proposals that can revolutionize voting and recognize that having it just on a Tuesday isn't necessarily the most effective way to increase turnout.
Samantha Lachman is a reporter for the Huffington Post. Her story online at huffingtonpost.com if you're interested in reading it. It's a nice long piece with a lot there. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks.
Come back and join us again. Good
Definitely.
having you here today. We'll get you caught up on the hour's top stories and the forecast straight ahead, and then helping sort out the confusion surrounding the Iran deal.